What beavers do is help slow down the flow of water and let it spread over the landscape so that they have deep enough water for habitat.
In northeastern Nevada, there is a creek that should not exist. It is green, wide, and full of life, sitting in the middle of a desert that has been in drought for years. But how? Because the rancher who managed the land once spent his very first week on the job blowing up dams on that same creek. At the time, he believed the animals building them were a problem, but years later, he realized something shocking. The same animals he had tried to remove were actually the reason the creek was still alive. And by the time people finally understood what those animals were really doing, most of them had already been wiped out across North America. So how did a few North American beavers manage to transform a dying desert creek into a thriving wetland ecosystem? And what does their return reveal about one of the most overlooked environmental disasters in American history? This is the story of Susie Creek and how mud, sticks, and 5 North American beavers transformed it into an oasis in the middle of the desert. Let's get into it. The creek that disappeared. Susie Creek is a 35-mile waterway in northeastern Nevada. In 1849, a pioneer Scots family named it after their daughter as they passed through on the trail to California. Back then, it was full of life. Willows on the banks, deep cold pools, fish threading through clean water. By 1989, it was as dry as a gravel bar. But how does that happen to a living, running creek? The answer is simpler and more brutal than you might expect. The Bureau of Land Management has more public land in Nevada than any other state in the country. And for most of that land's managed history, the approach to grazing was straightforward. Put cattle in, let them stay. Pull them out when the grass runs out. Ranchers ran their herds along Susie Creek during the hottest months of summer. The cattle went to the water and they stayed there. They trampled the banks. They stripped the willows down to bare nubs. They churned the creek bed into loose mud and manure that washed away with every rainfall. Without roots to hold the soil, the banks collapsed. Without willows to shade the water, temperatures rose. The channel cut deeper and deeper into the earth, while the floodplain dried out around it. Old irrigation ditches from the early ranching era still sat 10 to 15 feet above the creek's present level, silent proof of how much land had simply been scraped away over decades of use. IBLM, a photograph taken in September 1989, tells the whole story without a single word. Pale, bleached earth, no vegetation. A thin ribbon of water, barely holding on. A place in the process of disappearing. What happened to Susie Creek was not unusual. Across the American West, it was the norm, and fixing it would require something nobody had thought to try. A woman with a vision. In the early 1990s, a Bureau of Land Management fisheries biologist named Carol Evans drove out to Susie Creek, looked at that dry land, and decided she was not ready to accept what she saw. Evans was not a revolutionary. She was a practical, methodical scientist who had spent her career working with ranchers in Elko County, not against them. She understood that the rangeland did not belong to conservation goals on paper. It belonged to families who had been working it for generations. If she wanted to change how the land was treated, the ranchers had to want to change it too. Her proposal was simple. She went to John Griggs, the man who managed the 200,000-acre Maggie Creek Ranch that Susie Creek runs through, and asked him one question. What if the cattle stayed out of the creek banks during the hottest months of summer? Not permanently, not everywhere. Just during the window when the banks were most vulnerable, and the plants had the best chance of coming back. Griggs was skeptical. Ranchers had a long and difficult history with the Bureau, with conservation biologists, and especially with beavers. His first job on the ranch had been to blow up a beaver dam on Maggie Creek. The dam kept coming back, but the attitude it represented ran deep. He agreed to try anyway. In the first year, small native grasses slowly started growing again. They were weak at first, but they survived. In the second year, flowers and other plants came back too. The creek banks became stronger and stopped washing away so easily. Over the next several years, Evans and Griggs watched the creek slowly improve season by season. They added fences and changed when cattle were allowed to graze. With less damage from cattle, the creek finally had time to recover. Then something unexpected happened. Something nobody had planned for. Beavers started appearing in the desert, in a place where almost nobody expected them to survive. But why? To understand that, we need to go back hundreds of years to one of the most forgotten environmental disasters in North American history. The animal we erased. At their peak, there were somewhere between 60 and 400 million beavers in North America. That is not a measurement error. Scientists genuinely do not know how many there were, because the population was simply too vast to count. They occupied virtually every watershed on the continent, from the tundra to the desert edge, from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific. Everywhere there was water and a tree to chew, there were beavers. And everywhere there were beavers, the land worked differently. Beaver dams slow water down. Instead of rushing narrow and fast, water spreads wide. It pushes sideways into the soil, raises the water table, and creates the conditions for the kind of dense, lush vegetation that holds banks together and keeps streams cool. A watershed with beavers looks and functions completely differently from one without them. More water stays in it. It has more life. It is more resilient to drought, more resistant to flood, and more alive in every measurable way. The older civilizations understood this. They hunted beavers sustainably for thousands of years without depleting them, because they understood that the beaver's presence and the health of the land were inseparable. Then came the European fur trade. By the early 1600s, beaver felt had become the most fashionable hat material in Europe. Gentlemen, military officers, clergy, everyone who wanted to signal status wore one. European beavers had already been hunted to near extinction to supply that market. So when traders arrived in North America and found hundreds of millions of the animals, what happened next was as swift as it was devastating. Hudson's Bay Company trappers alone killed an estimated 3,000 beavers per year along a single river corridor in a single decade. Across the continent, tens of thousands were taken annually. The fur trade did not just supply Europe with hats. It opened the American interior, drove westward expansion, and helped define the borders of Canada and the United States. The beaver did not just build wetlands. In a very real sense, it built the country, and then it was almost gone. By 1900, a population that had once numbered in the hundreds of millions had been reduced to an estimated 100,000 animals, a decline of more than 99%. As the beavers vanished, the wetlands went with them, and the land began dying in ways nobody could have linked to a hat trend in European capitals, until a creek in Nevada started telling the story out loud. The original engineers. By the early 2000s, the willows were back, slow-growing and still thin, but unmistakably there. The banks were holding. The water ran cleaner. Carol Evans, who had spent more than a decade coaxing the creek back from the edge, began to sense that something was shifting. And then, without any announcement, the beavers showed up. Nobody brought them. Nobody built them a habitat or released them from a truck. They found the recovering willows on their own, followed the water upstream, and decided that Susie Creek was worth staying in for the first time in decades. One small family, 5 animals at most, and they immediately got to work. Within 2 years, more than 20 dams had gone up along a 5-mile stretch of creek. Each one was built in the same ancient way. Sticks driven into the stream bed, layered with branches and bark, packed tight with mud and stones, adjusted constantly until the water backed up into a pond deep enough to build a lodge in. The lodges rose from the ponds like small islands, and then the water started doing something it had not done in living memory. It spread. Instead of cutting a narrow trench and rushing away downstream, it pooled. It seeped sideways into the soil. Monitoring wells installed nearby showed something remarkable. The water table was rising. In some areas, It rose by 3 feet within just a few years. Springs that had been dry for decades. Old, forgotten seeps in the hillside that locals had stopped thinking about began to flow again. The gravel bar that had been Susie Creek and was baking under the Nevada sun in 1989 was becoming a dam, something that had no business existing in a desert. And yet, there it was. But the real story was not what you could see. It was what was happening underground. Engineering on instinct. When most people picture a beaver dam, they picture a simple wall. Water piles up. A pond forms. That is it. What is actually happening beneath the surface is something far older and far more sophisticated than it looks. U.S. Forest Service hydrologist Suzanne Foody stood at the edge of Susie Creek during one of Nevada's worst droughts and described it this way. What beavers do in all these itty-bitty streams is they create these small savings accounts, pockets where water is stored, no longer as snow, but as surface and groundwater. In the dry American West, rivers are mostly filled by melting snow, but after a few months, that water disappears, and many streams begin drying out. Beaver dams help store that water for later, keeping streams alive even during the hottest parts of summer. Here is how it works. When beavers build a dam, the water slows down and spreads out instead of rushing away downstream. Some of that water sinks deep into the ground and fills the soil underneath. This creates a natural underground water storage system that keeps the land wet for much longer. The ground becomes saturated. The water table rises. Soil that was cracked and dry begins holding moisture through the entire summer, even when no rain falls. That stored water is what keeps streams running long after the snowpack is gone. Beavers create it automatically, continuously, for free, and it does not stop there. The sediment trapped behind the dam slowly builds into rich organic soil. The pond's moderate temperature, cooler in summer, warmer in winter, ultimately creating the conditions that cold water fish need to survive. The wetland vegetation that grows up around the water filters pollutants and absorbs agricultural runoff. It is a complete ecosystem, a cycle in which each element feeds the next. A beaver dam is not a wall, it is a machine. Self-maintaining, self-repairing, self-expanding. Running entirely on instinct and mud and sticks, and it outperforms virtually anything human engineers have ever designed at a fraction of the cost. 20 self-maintaining, self-repairing water machines running on instinct and mud. And the results were something nobody in Elko County had seen in their lifetime. The desert comes back to life. The change at Susie Creek did not happen overnight, but it happened faster than anyone had expected. By 1999, water quality measurements downstream of the beaver ponds showed significant improvement, lower temperatures, cleaner flow. And then something appeared that had been absent from large stretches of the creek for decades. The Lahontan cutthroat trout, Nevada's state fish, the largest native freshwater trout in North America, capable of growing over 40 pounds in good conditions, and it had been disappearing across most of its historic range for years. But where the beavers had worked, the water was cold and deep and clear again. The trout came back, because the conditions it needed to survive came back. Satellite imagery told the story in numbers. Between the early 1990s and 2013, riparian vegetation along Susie Creek grew by over 100 acres. 100 acres of willows, sedges, grasses, and shrubs, where there had been bare gravel and cracked earth. Carol Evans stood at the creek one April morning during the 4th consecutive drought year in Nevada, and described what she saw. Just yards from where the desert stretched pale and cracked, the creek held a sprawling pond, surrounded by cattails and dense vegetation. In a single day, she watched muskrats, ducks, geese, egrets, mergansers, blackbirds, and sandhill cranes moving along the water. John Griggs, the ranch manager, had once been hired to blow up beaver dams. He had agreed to Evans's experiment with deep skepticism, and he now runs the Nevada Cattlemen's Association. He spoke at length at environmental symposiums across the country, describing what he had watched happen in language no scientist could improve on. "You think of the creek just as the water you can see," he said, "but a healthy creek is the water you can see, and a big sponge of water beneath it that hydrates the whole floodplain. Beavers, when they slow water down and back it up, they hydrate that sponge, and it allows for riparian vegetation to expand. For us, that means we get areas of green when nothing else is green." A creek that was dead in 1989 was full of sandhill cranes by 2005. That should have been the end of the story. But the honest version is not all rainbows and sunshine. Too soon, too fast. The story of Susie Creek is not entirely a triumph, and the honest version has to include the parts that are harder to tell. The beavers came back too soon. Carol Evans was direct about it. When the family colonized the creek in the early 2000s, the willows were still in early recovery, strong enough to attract beavers, but not strong enough to sustain them long-term. The animals began consuming willows faster than the trees could regrow. Some were drowned by rising pond water before they could mature. Evans estimated that another 5 to 10 years of recovery before the beavers arrived would have made the difference between a system that thrived and one that strained. The beaver needs the willow. The willow needs the groundwater that the beaver provides. If one gets too far ahead of the other, the whole system wobbles. And there is a wider problem beyond this single creek. What beavers once did automatically across the entire American West now has to be engineered and carefully managed, because there are so few of them left. Wildlife biologists across Nevada are now building what they call beaver dam analogs, artificial structures made of posts and woven willow branches that mimic what a real dam does. They work, but a human crew takes days to build what a beaver family builds and maintains on instinct alone. At Crowley Creek in northern Nevada, one of the last surviving populations of Lahontan cutthroat trout collapsed after beavers were removed. The deep, cold pools that the dams had maintained disappeared. A population that had once held thousands of fish fell below 500. Scientists had to intervene with artificial dams just to keep the trout from vanishing entirely. The lesson is almost unbearably simple. The beaver was not a bonus feature of the American landscape. It was load-bearing infrastructure. Strip it out, and the whole structure begins to fail in ways that take decades to become visible and generations to fully repair. What the desert taught us. John Griggs, who still wears a beaver felt hat, said something that has stayed with everyone who has ever reported on Susie Creek. It took all of us a cultural shift. We just didn't get it. He was not just talking about ranchers and beavers. He was talking about a century of treating the natural world as a resource to be extracted rather than a system to be understood, and about what it costs when you finally figure out the difference. NASA is now using satellites to track what happens when beavers are reintroduced to watersheds across the American West. Not because it is a charming wildlife story, but because in a warming, drying continent, beaver-restored wetlands are turning out to be one of the most cost-effective climate tools available. More flexible, more self-sustaining, and cheaper than almost anything human engineers have designed. The data is striking. In Idaho, reintroduced beavers transform the visible landscape within a single season. Patches of gray-brown streamside vegetation turn green within months of a family moving in. The change shows up from space. In Nevada, the state is quietly expanding its beaver reintroduction program across multiple watersheds. The goal is not just to restore individual streams, it is to rehydrate the invisible reservoir of groundwater beneath the desert that ranchers, towns, and entire ecosystems depend on. The beavers at Susie Creek did not know any of that. They did not understand they were reversing 150 years of continental-scale damage. They did not know that scientists would one day study their work from orbit. They were following the same instinct their ancestors had followed for millions of years: before a fashion trend in European capitals nearly erased them from the earth. 5 beavers, 1 dead creek, 30 years. That's the math on what happened at Susie Creek, Nevada. And it should change how you think about restoration, about nature, about what we've taken from this land and what it's still capable of giving back if we let it. So, what do you think about all this? Will the same strategy of reintroducing the North American beaver help restore damaged wetlands and streams in other places too? Drop your thoughts about this in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more stories like this. We'll see you next time.